I mean, clarifying deep issues I think is important. Why do you do what you do? And continually asking why till you really dive down deep until these core issues. And where does our identity come from? And unpacking all this. And because most people live on the surface, they tell themselves nice stories. We justify, we rationalize, but we really don't dive deep a lot of times.
Hey, my name is Steve Hinton, and I serve as a pastor and author.
I'm your co-host, Matthias. I serve as a personal trainer and a volunteer at my local church. Join us now for another episode of The Man Identity. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of The Man Identity. Thank you so much for giving us a little break last week. I was out doing some things, and so Steve gave a nice little celebratory intermission there. We reached 1,000 downloads, and if you don't know what that means, it basically means somebody listened to our podcast on Spotify, Apple, for over a minute. 1,000 people did that. So thank you all for doing that. We're over halfway to 100 subscribers on YouTube, which we're very excited about. And we appreciate each and every one of your support. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your comments, for liking, for subscribing, whatever thing you're doing. Thank you so much. So welcome back to another episode. Steve, who do we got today? What is the interview that we're listening to? What is this about?
Well, before I jump into that, I want to reiterate, I had not planned on doing YouTube when we kicked this off, and you were like, Steve, no, we need to do this. We need to do this. And I've enjoyed some of the shorts that you have put out there as well. I know you're busy and you've had some time to do that, but I do want to throw YouTube out there, everybody, that you can find The Man Identity on YouTube. I think it was like 55, 56 subscribers, something like that. And we want to ask you to do that. There is a place also in YouTube where you can leave comments and questions. So that will generate some fun as well. But yes, indeed. I'm still learning all the data, but over I think last I checked for the downloads were, I don't know, 1,025, something like that. And so that's exciting. I heard the other day from somebody up in Indiana who is listening now. So that's all encouraging. So we're grateful. We're grateful for all that.
Yes, we're grateful. Yeah, but if you don't want to see our ugly mugs, you can stay on Apple, Spotify, whatever. But no, we're glad you're here. Thank you so much, guys.
So, okay, here's the deal, Matthias. When we kick this thing off, one of the points that I made about being a man, first we find our identity in being created in the image of God, and there's purpose to that, and there's beauty to that, and there's strength to that. God made us strong, and Dr. Barry Davis did a good job talking about that a couple of weeks ago. But one of my observations, or one of my challenges, is that as a man, we really ought to know a little bit about a lot of things, and even when it comes to sports. Now, my vocation, the first thing that God has called me to is being a pastor, being a preacher, and I expound the Word of God on a regular basis. And one of the things that preachers know is that you have to preach to yourself as well. And one of the things that you and I are united on here, the audience needs to know that Matthias and I are divided by age, facial hair. I'm older.
You can grow a good mustache, though.
I don't know if I can. Well, okay, a stash I could. But one of the things that Matthias and I have in common is that we are not basketball fans.
No.
We are not. When I lived in the Sacramento area, I watched the Kings play a couple times. I've been in Houston now for pushing on 16 years now. I have not seen the Rockets play at all, but it has been my belief that as a growing man, that I want to influence the world. I want to be in the world. I want to make a difference. That I ought to know a little bit about basketball. I don't know if you are aware of this or not, Matthias, but we are in the NBA playoffs right now. Obviously, the Rockets are not there. Well, I can't say obviously because someone like you or me wouldn't even know that. But the Houston Rockets did not make the playoffs, but the Spurs are there. The Spurs are in the playoffs, and I grew up in Amarillo, which is close to Oklahoma, and the Oklahoma City Thunder are in the playoffs. And anyway, here's the guest. I actually called up one of my cousins who played professional basketball in Europe, and Brandon is the youngest of my cousins on my mom's side of the family. He went to the University of Texas in El Paso, graduated, I think it was maybe in 2001. And at the time when he graduated, he was the highest scoring player in the history of UTEP. I think now he's down to number 3. But Brandon played basketball. He played basketball in Europe for a while, and he's a younger man of faith, and he works for a organization called Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which has been around for quite a while. I remember hearing of Fellowship of Christian Athletes in high school, but Brandon's going to talk about us, about us. He probably is talking about us. Brandon's going to talk to us about just some basketball, and then some of his own journey, and maybe guys, you can learn something, because his journey is not one where everything happened exactly the way he wanted it to happen.
Yeah.
And a lot of times in life, we have a plan, and for whatever reason, God does not allow us to work our plan out. And part of it, man, is just deciding, okay, what am I going to do about that? Am I going to shrink back, or I'm going to go forward? Am I going to follow God, even though my plans have not worked out? And then he's going to talk about FCA and what they do, and a few lessons that we can pull from that. So it was good to connect with my cousin. I'm older than him, but my goodness, he looks like a basketball player.
He does. He just looks tall from, like, just, you can just see him in the video. He looks tall. But yeah. All right. Without further ado, then, it's a good interview, guys. You got some good lessons in here, so we'll go ahead and roll it.
Well, Brandon, I'm glad that you rushed home from the school that you were serving in earlier today to meet with me and get this done for the Man Identity. There are a couple things, well, 3 things I want to do today, Brandon. I definitely want to look at FCA, and I really love this comment on your website, and I'm going to want you to unpack this later on. I think it's huge. On the National FCA website, it says, "You have been placed and gifted by God. It's time to make an impact." And I love that. And I want to hear more about that. I kind of want our listeners to hear some of your own story, because you played professional basketball in Europe, and you're just an amazing athlete. But I also want to hear a little bit about basketball. And here's why. One of the premises about the Man Identity, obviously the main thing is you just need to see who you are in Christ, and move and grow into the man that God created you to be. But we want to know just a little bit about, a lot of things. I am not a big basketball guy. I remember when our grandfather died, and all the cousins were there, and everybody's taller than me. And it was like a line of NBA players. And then it's me at the end. I'm like a jockey compared to all you guys. But I don't know if you remember this, Brandon, and I think it's funny, but you and your brother were at home, and I was watching you 2 guys, and you were, I don't know, mid-elementary school. We were in your front yard throwing a football, and I threw a football at you, and you said, "Come on, Steve, can't you throw the ball any better than that?"
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
I'm thinking I probably should have buried you when I had the opportunity at the time, because I was bigger than you. But to begin with basketball, I don't know if you'd be interested in this or not. Your mother would, but I actually have one of your playing cards when you were at UTEP. I don't know how much, a couple $100,000 we can get for that or not, but I know that you were you hold, I think you're in 3rd place, 3rd highest record holder there at UTEP. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But Brandon, what are some things that guys need to know about basketball? My understanding is that it really took off incredibly fast. In other words, it was started in, I think, like 1891 in a YMCA, and then within 10 years, it's like all over the place. But where did this sport come from, and how did it pick up so fast?
I think the only thing guys need to know about basketball and its origins is that James Naismith put up some peach baskets. Yeah. And they threw a ball into it, and they ended up cutting the hole at the bottom, and basketball's invented. And I don't think anybody talks about the sport from then until maybe the 50s.
Okay.
And maybe it spread fast and all this stuff, and it developed, and they, obviously got real courts, real rims, real basketballs, and started getting the rules in place. But the history of basketball is really just driven by the players that are famous in the era.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about that, I mean, that's how you talk about the history of basketball is the first era, your George Mikens, you guys like that are really old black and white pictures, the first known players, and then up through the famous players from era to era. And that's how basketball is talked about. It's talked about through its players, through its eras, and then you argue about which era is better and how players could do in different eras and all that kind of stuff. But no one, to my knowledge, ever talks about from the point that James Naismith put up the peach baskets to the point that the NBA started becoming well known. No one talks about that. No one knows anything about that. But obviously it did happen. Obviously the sport spread, became very popular, and then, but from the 50s on, is if anybody's going to talk about basketball, that's what they talk about.
Okay. So my understanding is that the NBA as we know it today started in like 1946. Is that right or about right?
I don't even know the exact year. Sometime in that era. Yeah.
Okay.
And then you had, George Mikan, obviously the first kind of star, big guy. And then the ABA was, and then I don't even remember either. The ABA and NBA merged in the 70s. I think it's in the 70s. And then that gave us the modern NBA as we know it right now. And of course, you had college basketball going on this whole time too.
Yeah.
And, just maybe even more popular, especially locally. Obviously, people tied into their colleges. And so you had those two parallel tracks going on. And
now, who are some of your top players and why? I found this interesting. Most people have heard of Michael Jordan, and I did a search the other day, and I know you've got all kinds of stats, all kinds of categories, and I remember looking at one, and Jordan was not even in the top 10 for whatever category this was. But who are some of your top players and why?
Well, I mean, Jordan's number one. I mean, his dominance, his peak was unmatched. I know this is an interminable debate, especially people that have only seen LeBron play, and but then the argument that clinches everything is just 6-0. Jordan was 6-0 in his finals. LeBron's 4-6, and so I put LeBron probably 2. His longevity is unmatched, the greatest stat stuffer of all time. At his peak, just as good as anybody but Jordan. And I mean, most people put the same people in the top 10. With Bird, Magic, and Shaq, and Chamberlain, or Tim Duncan, or who Kobe, those same kind of guys. But I would put for sure Jordan, and then I mean, you don't have to go into the details of the argument, but just everything he did, the dominance, the height, and and just his performance on the biggest stage. And then LeBron, I would probably put 2. Even yeah.
Now, so thinking about Jordan, you could probably confirm this, but and I think this would be a manhood lesson, a bravery and endurance lesson. My understanding, I don't know if it was his senior year in high school or sometime in high school, that Jordan was benched. Coach didn't think he was good enough, but he continued on, and the rest is history. But is there something to that story?
Yeah, he was cut early in high school. He was actually cut from the team, and then he's maniacal in his workout and his will to win and all that stuff, as he famously is. And he came back and obviously became extremely dominant very quickly. But yeah, he was cut, and I mean that's a big lesson for today when everybody transfers, at a college level and more at a high school level, and wants to quit and run away when everything's not going well, or the grass is always greener. It's the coach's fault. I'm going to go do something somewhere else, get a chance. Sticking with it and fighting against opposition. You see that less and less today, just because of the way the whole system is.
Yeah. Well, I would think not just the system, but just in other words, not the sporting system, but just the world that we live in today. The lack of fortitude, the lack of endurance, or the lack of loyalty. That I'm gonna stick with my team. I'm gonna stick with my family. I'm gonna stick with my spouse. I'm gonna push through no matter what.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it just comes. It's easier to see in the sports world, and because it happens so quickly now, from year to year, and just quitting and going to the next team and quitting. But I mean, there's no loyalty on any side. Coaches can get rid of players really easily now in college. It's not a 4-year scholarship from their perspective. It's everything's just short term. What can you do for me now? Yeah, it's just the whole system, and it's hard to blame players. It's hard to blame coaches for the system, because within the system, they're going to operate within their best interest, and that's understandable. So it's more the system is terrible.
Okay.
Now that doesn't excuse like at a youth level when you're quitting and changing teams, going from one AAU team to the next or something like that. But you know, at a college level, it's so heavily debated right now with NIL transfers and stuff. And I know, you know, we work a lot with college athletes with FCA, and you know, I don't blame the kids all the time. Sometimes it is their fault, but you know, it's just the system's terrible. So,
okay,
but
now,
yeah, the complete lack of fortitude. You're right, from top to bottom.
Now, I know we're switching sports here, but my understanding when you go to Europe and you go to football, which is what we call soccer, somebody gets on a team and they're with that team pretty much their whole life. Is that accurate?
Well, I mean, because they have the academy system versus high school and college system. So pretty much outside of the United States, sports are not within a school.
Okay.
You know, they're outside of school. You're joining a club. So, you know, I was in Europe for 5 years, and so we saw a lot of the soccer clubs, and a lot of the basketball clubs mimic the soccer club system, where
Okay.
you join when you're younger, and then basically you're developed through levels. So if you're good enough, you're just going to move up, play with older guys, and you're just trying to progress up the system. And at a certain point, if you're not good enough, you're out. If you're good enough, you keep going. Another big difference is, you know, if you're good, the club's going to pay for you. You know, club sports in America, these parents are shelling out unbelievable amounts of money for their daughters to play volleyball, their sons to play baseball and travel and all this stuff. And ultimately for what? You know, a lot of times it's just a moneymaker for these clubs and these teams, but the academy system keeps these kids within that team a lot longer. Now they can move from team to team, especially once they become like true professional. But you're going to sign longer term contracts.
Okay. Okay.
Kind of more like the NBA. You know, you're not. Yeah, you have guys that go 1 year here, 1 year there, but they're stars that are trying to lock up. But it is possible for a player to, you know, stay with the club an entire time from like youth up through the developmental stages and the levels up to professional. So.
Well, that kind of reminds me, and I know it's not the same, but it makes me think of baseball. My goodness, here we are. We're all over the place with sports today, but it makes me think of baseball because you've got farm teams.
Yeah, I think it's similar. Except for even in baseball, people are moving around a lot more. And that by the time you get into the farm system, you're outside of high school, you know, you're older. So, I mean, these academies, they start with, you know, elementary age kids. And if you're really good, you know, Luka Doncic left home and went to Real Madrid when I can't remember the exact age, but when he's very, very young. So some of these kids are leaving home, the ones that are like truly unique and elite. And being developed from a very young age within that academy. So it's basically a full-time job when you're a teenager. So that's very different than America. You know, high school and AAU and all these competing elements. And there's not like one centralized system, especially for basketball.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this, talking about young people and professional sports and basketball and Olympics. I'm reminded, and I can't remember the year, but they referred to it as the dream team when the U.S. Put out, I mean, I guess you wouldn't say fielded, whatever you would say in basketball, but they put on the U.S. Olympic basketball team. They put the pros like Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, and it's like they dominated. And I always thought that was a bad move to allow professionals to go to the Olympics. You know, maybe that's just me, but what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think it was great. Why would you not want the best athletes in your country competing? And so we kept sending college guys over there before the dream team. And so you have, you know, the best players in the world playing against and we got 18, 19, 20-year-old kids playing. I mean, to me, you should have the best athletes. Who cares if they're professional or amateur? You know, those distinctions are from 80 years ago and irrelevant to today. And the only time you even heard of amateurism was when the NCAA was trying not to pay players. That was that was the only thing amateurism even came into existence for. Well, it persisted in existence was to keep college athletes from getting any money. So I thought the dream team was great. It awakened the world to basketball as well.
So if I'm hearing you right, Brandon, what you're saying is prior to that, other countries had professionals playing. It was just the U.S. that did not.
Well, I mean, like, speaking of Don Haskins, he was an assistant coach in 1972. Jim Forbes, who's a UTEP player, and he was a longtime coach actually at Andrews High School, actually the school I was just at for a little bit. They were on the Olympic team that famously Russia, the Soviet Union, they replayed the final play 3 different times until the Soviets were able to score. But you look back at these guys and, were they pro, were they not? I don't even remember all the rules that they implemented, but we were playing against men and we were sending young guys. So Haskins was assistant coach on that team. Forbes was a player. And this is when they refused to come out and accept their silver medals. If you remember this scene,
I don't.
Yeah, this is 1972 Olympics. So basically I think it was in I'd have to look it up where it was. I think it was in the Soviet Union. If not, I can't remember exactly where it was, but they let them replay the play until they've scored to win the game, essentially. So the Americans were like, forget this. We're ripped off. And so, but it's interesting because you have El Paso connections there. So Don Haskins.
That is interesting. Okay. Well, Brandon, let's talk about your story. You mentioned Don Haskins, and I want to tell our listeners about a movie that came out in 2006 called Glory Road, about Haskins and how he brought some black players on, and he brought them on because they were good players, and he didn't care about race. He's like, he cared about character. He was a tough coach. He was a good coach. He said, you can do this. But you played for UTEP. Now, Brandon, I understand your faith journey a little bit. I know that you came to know Christ early in your life. Were there any challenges along the way where, I don't know, maybe you doubted your faith or doubted some of the things about the Bible, or doubted whether or not God cares about you? Were there any challenges that you had from having embraced Christ at a very early age, in early elementary school up through manhood?
I think the main one early on, at least, is, when you become a Christian, when you're 6, at a certain point, you're like, what did that mean? Is that real? Did I really decide to follow Christ? And I remember going through that for a little while, maybe, I can't even remember exactly, but probably about middle school.
Okay.
And so reaffirming, did I understand the gospel? Was this legitimate since I was so young? And I came to the conclusion it was, because I did understand it was legit, but I had to wrestle with that for a while. And I think every church kid, grows up in an environment surrounded by Christianity. And at a certain point, you got to get to why do I believe this? Do I really believe this? Or is this something I kind of inherited?
Right.
Of course, anybody's going to inherit the environment they grow up in, whether you're atheist or Muslim or whatever.
Right.
At a certain point, you got to, why do I believe this? And work through it. So I never had a real big crisis of faith, but I did have a crisis of obedience. That's for sure. And learning, and this took decades, I'm 46 now, and just decades of, how to live this out. A lot of churches back then, this is the 80s. It was all about getting saved and not much about sanctification and not much about growing in Christ. It was all about, you're on the team, you're good to go, see you later. And I can't remember one, I'm sure there was, but I'm just talking about looking back in youth group and, the idea of putting sin to death, being identified with Christ in his death, being raised to newness of life, and the foundations of our sanctification, like in Romans chapter 6, and count yourself dead to sin, but alive to Christ, alive to God in Christ Jesus, and how to do that and how to live that out. And we just didn't talk about it. So I think that was a big issue, looking back, just because I didn't know how to be obedient, because immediately you start talking about obedience in that environment at church, and that immediately people think you're compromising faith alone and you're introducing works. And so that was a struggle looking back. There's a lot of ups and downs over the years, for sure. But
okay, so obedience is a word that we don't like a lot in 2026. But how important is that?
Well, I mean, Jesus said, if you love me, you obey my commands. And there's many such verses as that. And obedience is tied so closely to faith, not in the sense that it's part of faith, but obedience is tied scripturally as the outworking of faith. Ephesians 2:10 talks about we're his workmanship. We were created anew in Christ unto good works that he prepared beforehand for us. But I think of Matthew 25, when Jesus is separating the sheep and the goats. There's John 5:29, Romans 2, there's several passages where, we're judged on our works. And Jesus separates the sheep and the goats based on their works. Now, how do you figure that in with faith alone? We're justified only by faith. The works aren't a part of it. So when you put the whole picture together, we don't have time to go through all the details, but the whole picture,
do not.
We're saved by faith alone actually through faith alone would be the correct terminology, by grace alone, in Christ alone. But if that's real, you're going to live it out, and you're going to be walking in the light, putting to death sin in your life. And Romans 8:12 and 13 talk about, all this stuff comes together. So, but if you're not obeying, you're probably not a Christian, and you have to be very careful when you say that, because obedience is the evidence, is the fruit, it's a growing thing. It's a struggle that goes up and down. But, Jesus said very clearly, if you love me, you obey my commandments.
Yeah. My understanding, it's not, and I think that's John, latter part of John chapter 14. And it's not so much, hey, prove your obedience to me, but it's one of, obedience is just the fruit, the outgrowth of this relationship. I'm glad you brought up that a passage in Ephesians chapter 2, I think it's 8-10, where Paul uses the word, and I think the Greek word is poema, and we get the English word poem from it. And the poem is this idea of something that's crafted. Obviously with language, it's a word or a song or something, but it's this idea that God crafts us with a purpose to go do something. And I think that ties into the statement from FCA earlier that I want to get to. But tell me about this, Brandon, with your journey of struggle. So your senior year, take us from your senior year in high school, where you were off for a couple of years and you started playing basketball, and this historic coach comes to you, Don Haskins, and he recruits you. What are you thinking? And I know you're excited, but what are you thinking? And then what were some of your thoughts as you went through your 4 years at UTEP, and then you had I guess an agent, but you weren't drafted by the NBA, but you played basketball in Europe, and then you came back. What were some of the key points in that part of your journey?
I think looking back, the world was just so different back then. We kind of project now back into then. Everybody's hyper aware of everything now, because of the internet and phones and all that stuff. But back then, where did you get your information from? So we didn't have cable growing up until I think my senior year, where we had ESPN. I could actually watch some college basketball games. We had dial-up internet. I didn't know who Don Haskins was. Let's put it that. I remember in 1992, UTEP made it to the Sweet 16. I remember the orange jerseys. That's pretty much it. But I didn't know anything about Don Haskins, a story, the 1966 championship team, all the stuff that we would know immediately now just from searching and all that. Back then I didn't. So I was very, very naive going through this process, and met Coach Haskins on my recruiting trip, and got to know him a little then, got to play. But as soon as I got down here in 1997, the fall of 97, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. So that started they had big celebrations, and, all these people that coached with and played for and came back into town and stuff like that. So that's when I really got introduced to what really had happened, and the significance, and all the connections that Haskins had over the years. And so that's when I became more aware of all that. But again, it's right now we know everything about everything to the point it's paralyzing. And
we know too much. We know too much sometimes.
Yeah. So, I mean, here's the example I use when I was doing a lot of coaching is when I was growing up and you want to get better at basketball shooting, where would you go? How would you do that? Well, you might be lucky and have a good coach that can help you, but where would you go to find anything about how to shoot better? You pretty much had to figure it out by yourself. Maybe you watch something on TV, but there's no resources. Now you go to YouTube and search basketball shooting, you're going to get 20 million videos.
Right.
So back then the problem was, what do I do? And now the problem is how do I navigate this flood of information to focus on what actually works? And I think that's important spiritually too, because it's the same thing.
Oh yeah.
Like navigating. Coaching now is navigating and providing a roadmap. Coaching back then was providing more information, and so it's different, I think, in both sports world and spiritually.
Okay. Yeah. Now you got married while you were in college.
I did, but before my senior year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What was the mental emotional process as you were going into your senior year and you were thinking about maybe the NBA, and then as way goes on to way, you find out that you're playing in Europe, and I kind of remember that. I don't remember which country I think you were in, like Italy for a while. But were there any disappointments there? What was the mental and emotional process, and what did you learn in that part of the journey?
Well, coming into my senior year, I mean, I didn't know what to expect. again, kind of naive era. I happened to, I happened to come out with right when the era when everybody was signing high school players. And
Okay.
so if you stayed to your senior year, you were kind of devalued. You have no upside, and a lot less value for someone who stayed versus someone who's still in high school, has a lot of upside potential to develop them, all that kind of stuff. So I think that kind of hurt me. I don't know the exact reasons, but I did well my senior year, but for whatever reason didn't make the NBA, and so it had to shift more towards like, okay, we got to go to Europe. And but honestly, I was burnt out, man. I think that's
okay.
So I went over to Europe. I went to Greece for 2 months, and I wasn't prepared for international ball, and that's another difference between now and back then. International ball is so different. I wasn't prepared to be looking back. I wasn't prepared to be a professional at the way you have to be a professional for overseas at that time.
Okay.
And it's a lot different than the NBA, where they provide everything for you, give you every resource. It's kind of opposite. It's more like you're on your own. You better perform. A couple bad games, you're out of here.
Okay.
You're living halfway around the world in a country that doesn't speak your language, even though a lot of the younger people speak English. And if anybody's been to Europe, you know how many people do speak English.
Mm-hmm.
But wasn't ready for that side of it. So I actually bounced around. I actually got cut from Greece, had 2 bad games at the wrong time. If your team's losing, you're a young guy, no street cred. So I got cut. So I went to Italy. No, I actually went to Poland. I could have stayed there, but I'd offered to go to Italy. And then I was there in Italy for a month and really didn't have a chance to play. It was kind of just a weird situation in Italy. And so when I played the game, I had like 6 minutes, 8 minutes, nothing really, not a real chance, I guess you could say. So after a while, I was like, forget this. So I just went back to America, finished my degree, and I didn't play basketball
this was like a master's degree or something you were working on.
No, this is just at this point in time, I was just finishing up my bachelor's.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I needed a semester. Back then, the business college here was a 4.5-year degree.
Okay.
And I was here 4 years. So I had to go back, finish out. It wasn't that much more to finish it out. And so I didn't touch a basketball for over a year. And I worked for FCA back then 3 years, more or less, and then got the itch to play again. So I started working out and went back overseas to Spain for 5 years. And that was a much better experience the second time around.
Okay.
So I was in 5 full seasons over there. Much better second time, mentally prepared more, understood how it works. And just being a little older, of course, that helps too. So.
Well, you don't know this, Brandon, or maybe you do, but we were in Sacramento, California for 5 years. And I remember one time I was way over on the southeast corner of Sacramento, and I drove way over to the northwest part of Sacramento where the Kings play. And I had a portfolio of all your stuff. And I tried to go in there and get you a spot. And they're like, well, we want to see some video. And I said, I don't have any video. And they said, well, come back when you have some video. So maybe I let you down on that. I don't know if you would have wanted to play for the Kings anyway.
Man, now I know, Steve, it's all your fault. That's why I didn't make it, man. So.
Well, let's talk about FCA. And again, I love that statement, Brandon, that is on, and this is not your personal website. It's on the national website. You have been placed and gifted by God. It's time to make an impact. Tell me about that statement.
Well, the vision of FCA is to see the world transformed by Jesus Christ, or through Jesus Christ, by the influence of coaches and athletes. So the idea of FCA started around the influence that athletes and coaches naturally have, just because their cultural position, the cultural position that sports has, and the fact that people will listen to, this could be good or bad, obviously. People will listen to athletes just because they're athletes. People will listen to coaches just because they're coaches. So the guy who started FCA was looking around and seeing athletes endorse everything from cigarettes to washing machines to cars or whatever. And he's like, why not Jesus? And so that's kind of where it started. And so it started as a camp ministry for the first 10 or so years. And Branch Rickey, who's the guy that was integral to Jackie Robinson getting signed with the Dodgers, and coming into the major leagues. Branch Rickey got on board early. That was a big boost. And but the whole idea of using the influence that coaches and athletes have to spread the gospel was kind of the founding vision of FCA. Now expanded to camps. The camps expanded, but extended to campus ministry, working with coaches, working with athletes of all different levels. And now it's international, over 115 countries. FCA sports, which is like youth sports, whether it's running a league or a club team within another league. So branching out into a lot of different things. But I think the easiest way to think about influence is, you ask, almost everybody's played sports at some level. Most people, the vast majority.
I played basketball for 1 year in the 8th grade, and that didn't go too well.
Steve, I know how athletic you are, so you're in that exception group. So yeah.
Well, I play rugby.
And you ask most people outside of their parents, the next most influential person in their life is almost always a coach.
Yeah.
And again, that could be good or that could be bad. And so athletes are influential, but more kind of on a come and go basis. It's more like a event, but coaches are influential on a long-term basis. And so cultivating that and helping people grasp that and use that for Christ. And so ministering to athletes in different ways, ministering to coaches in different ways, is kind of the core of FCA and kind of what we're about, and just basically using sports to open doors for the gospel.
So Brandon, I know that you're kind of a regional director there in El Paso, and you work with coaches, you work with schools and students, but on a personal coaching level, I don't know where, maybe it was on Instagram for UTEP El Paso or wherever, but you made a comment about coaching the total person. And you talk about, number one, coaching the total person. And then you talk about this reality that I am the third mentality. What do you mean by those two things?
Well, I think when we talk about coaching the total person, and younger coaches and some older ones that are really tuned into cultural shifts, it's just something you hear a lot more. So in my era, no one ever talked about emotions outside of just, you got to be tough and suck it up. And no one ever talked about mental training, like you're going to develop your mind. No one ever for sure talked about like the spiritual aspect. So you went out, you did your job. If things are going poorly for you, suck it up. If things are going poorly off the court, suck it up, and just do your job, and the only other thing we heard to be, just be tougher, there's a lot of value to that. Suck it up and be tough. There's a lot of value to that for sure.
There's a place for that. Yeah.
But it has to be balanced also with cultural shifts. Kids are so much more sensitive these days, so much more echo chambers in their heads, echo chambers on their phones, echo chambers everywhere. And there's a lot of more fragility today. So you have to almost, if you want someone to be a good athlete, you have to, I think it's good principle and practice no matter what, but especially these days, you want someone to be a good athlete, you have to think about who they are as a person, where they are emotionally, where is their mental space. And then, but tying all this, if you ignore the fact that we're spiritual beings, created in the image of God, made to be in fellowship with Him, and ignore that whole side of it, then you're just giving you're just putting a Band-Aid on it. And so coaching the total person involves all those aspects. It's not just what you do on the court. It's everything that's behind that leading up to it. And I think the total athlete needs a maturity on an emotional level, needs a maturity on the mental level, but most importantly needs to be tied in spiritually to God. And of course, you're going to be limited in some of these aspects in some situations. You can't just have a church service in the middle of a basketball practice at a public school, but we try to fit in and fill in those gaps as much as we can. And so, it's just kids are different now. Some of the dates often thrown out there is 2012 is when half the population got a smartphone. And
oh, wow.
So you see these trends really accelerate, and this is hard for us to understand, Steve. We grew up in an era where we remember life before the internet. We remember life before smartphones and all that stuff. And so when your whole life is built around externalizing your thoughts, externalizing your identity, creating a persona online and having to live up to all these different things. And just with an athlete, that's almost everybody does that these days, but with an athlete, that's times 1,000 because you're well known, you're in the public eye, pressures are coming at you from every which direction. So, I go to a lot of like college practices now. It's just different. The way you have to interact with people, the way you have to coach them, the way you have to teach them, the way you have to train them. It's just different just because the technological environment is different. The cultural environment is different. And so if I'm a coach and I want my athletes to be successful, I'm going to have to address these things. I'm going to have to address, how do I mentally stay in the moment? How do I mentally move on from mistakes? It sounds like simple stuff, but it's, without techniques and without training, and you're in the public eye and you're on Instagram and you're on TikTok and people can DM you and say stuff about you and do all this stuff, and they have instant connection to you.
Yeah.
Man, it's a tough world. So I mean, the real answer would be, don't be on any of that stuff and stay off your phone. But people aren't going to do that. But,
well, maybe they should. Brandon, I would also think that part of the deal today is that you're going to have more and more young athletes who grew up without a dad in the house, or a dad who was sporadic, or a dad who was maybe there but just didn't give a rip about him. So there's this place where you can't be the kid's dad. You cannot be the kid's dad, but being able to offer some fatherly advice and wisdom, and maybe little snippets. I'm thinking, I guess let me ask you this. You talked about being able to move on after a mistake. So let's say you got a guy, and maybe he's not even an athlete. Maybe he's in college and he's going to be an accountant, or he's going to be an engineer or something. And he has 2 or 3 bumps in the road. His girlfriend dumps him. He applies for 2 jobs, 2 internships, and he gets rejected at both, and 2 or 3 other things. And he is just wanting to throw in the towel. What would you say to him in that moment in time?
Well, I think having a relationship where you can genuinely connect. And I think that's one of the big shifts in coaching. My era, Coach Haskins would just yell at us and tell us to suck it up and keep going,
Mm-hmm.
And now, people have difficulty with emotional regulation when you're attacking them, so you don't see coaches as crazy as they used to. And of course there are crazy coaches for sure. You hear stories coming out, but being able to connect with them and, clarifying deep issues, I think, is important. Why do you do what you do? And continually asking why till you really dive down deep until these core issues. And where does our identity come from, and unpacking all this. And because most people live on the surface, they tell themselves nice stories. We justify, we rationalize, but we really don't dive deep a lot of times. And I think starting there is important, but that's a relationship a coach or someone connected to a staff would develop over time, where they can actually speak truth into life. Because what I see, especially at a college level right now, these kids are moving around, transferring so much. They're just closed in, not open up very much. They just view themselves as independent contractors, moving from one school to the next every 8 to 9 months, not connecting with people. So it become very difficult sometimes to penetrate that shell. And so having a way to penetrate the shell would be the first step. And that takes time, takes a relationship. And it's just harder and harder the way it is right now, at least in college sports. It's just becoming harder. But I think you got to clarify at a deep level first, and then understand who they are. So when, like, for example, with the basketball team here with FCA, the guys who are coming, we just went through the big picture of scripture over the entire year. How can I understand who I am as a man without understanding, well, what we were created for in the first place, and what was in place before the fall? The idea I'm supposed to keep, and I'm supposed to tend the garden. And work is a good thing, and I'm supposed to protect, and I'm supposed to do all these things, and that's there before the fall. So what does that tell me? And then, but what does the fall actually do? What does sin actually do? And then how's the process of restoration and redemption happen? So we just went through the big picture, because I think we decontextualize so much. Even the Bible is decontextualized, Instagram style, pick a verse here and there, and it's randomly thrown out. But if we're going to dive deep into someone's life, they need to understand their place in God's story. And the only place we can do that is to really unpack the big picture, and not decontextualize everything. And then slowly kind of rebuild up from the ground up when possible. And if I understand John Calvin said we're supposed to talk, understand God, but to understand ourselves, we have to understand God first. And there's this interplay, and there's an interplay between our knowledge of God and knowledge of ourselves. And I think that's crucial, because you get God out of the picture and you're just kind of making it up. You're just making it up. So
it's survival of the fittest, and make it up. And the mental, emotional crisis that we have in our day is huge. So Brandon, you worked for FCA for a while, and then you did a few other things. Then you came back, and you're kind of the city director there in El Paso. My assumption is that, you receive a salary, but it's something that you have to raise. Is that correct?
Yeah, anything like this, FCA is kind of like so many other ministries. Yeah, we raise our own funds to support us, and all the staff people that work for FCA, it's the same.
Okay, if someone wanted to get more information on you, wanted to maybe support you or just get some more information, where would they go to find you?
Well, I mean, the easiest place, my email,
Okay.
is B and then my last name, Wolfram@fca.org.
Okay.
Our local website is elpasofca.org. We have a lot of information locally of what's going on here. And there's a contact form on the website too. And if anybody's interested, but yeah, we'd love to share what we're doing here. Paso's a unique place, different from almost everywhere else in America, but it's a good place. So.
Well, different than a lot of places in Texas too. people forget about how big Texas is. It's like, it's like bigger than Europe sometimes. Okay, Brandon, let me ask you this. You talked about how over a school year, a couple semesters or whatever, you were able to unpack the big story of the historical gospel narrative, the truth of who we are, God's creation, and the redemption, what Jesus did for us, and all that. But you had a semester or a full year to do that. Let's say, Brandon, you've got a young man in front of you, and he's a senior in high school, early college age, and Brandon, you've only got one shot. Only got one shot. Just a minute. What would you say to him?
Man, well, I would probably, in FCA, we have something called the 4, which is not unique to FCA. It's just a quick way to share the gospel. We give out wristbands, we have shirts, all this stuff. It's just a quick way to summarize the gospel. And it's basically taking what I did over the whole year with FCA, the Bible study we did, and compressing it just into a short gospel message. Because if you only have a short amount of time, you want to start with what's most important. And so the 4 is just very simple. It starts with a heart. That's the first symbol. And it's God's love for us. And he created us to be in fellowship with him. And so basically summarize that very quickly and then say there's a huge problem, a huge problem. And that's the fact that sin divides us. And the second symbol is a division sign. And this is something we tend to, 200 years ago was all fire and brimstone, and today it's all grace. Jesus came in grace and truth. So emphasizing what sin does, the devastating consequences of it, of course, eternally, separation from God means eternal devastation in hell, eternal destruction in hell, but also the effects of sin now and the corruption and just of everything it does. So you can't downplay that. And I think in the American gospel often is all grace with no sin. So I always, when a lot of times when I talk, I say, when I remember a bumper sticker a long time ago when I was growing up, and it was one of those that was mocking Christians that said, if Jesus is the answer, what's the question? I was like, that's actually a great thought. We present Jesus as the answer to everything. He's going to save me of all this devil. What are we being saved from? And why do I need him in the first place? And if we don't adequately explain the bad news, then the good news doesn't make sense. So God loves you, explaining that sin separates you. And then we say in FCA, Jesus rescues you. So, and then explaining what that meant in a succinct way. But, and then the last thing is always personalizing it. Will you trust Jesus? Okay. So we'd like to give all these wristbands away in FCA because I don't know, kids love wristbands these days, man. And everybody always takes one. That gives us a chance to share the gospel, so they can remember it and they can also share it with others. But that's where I'd start. The core thing. People don't need pep talks. They don't need moral improvement programs. They need the gospel first. Okay. And every time I get a chance to talk to athletes or coaches, it's so easy in the sports world to turn everything into work really hard to please God message. And that's not the message most people need. If they're already a Christian and they need to obey, then maybe that's the message. But generally it's not a moral quest to make God like you enough so you can be acceptable to him. It's the gospel first, that we are completely sinful and God gives us his righteousness through Christ. So when we put our faith in him, that exchange happens. Our sins unto him, his righteousness is counted as ours. So we're declared righteous before God. And just really unpacking the gospel first as the foundation. Because otherwise, everything for athletes is typically a performance mentality. I work hard, I do well, people like me more. I get more applause, I get more approval, get more likes, get more everything. And that feeds into the spiritual lives of almost every athlete, myself included. So everything becomes a performance mentality. I got to work really hard to please God and make myself acceptable. And so I try to be clear every time I get a chance. No, that's not how it works. We want to please God, but kind of like we were talking about earlier, but as a result of what he's done, as the fruit of the Spirit working within me, not as a way to make myself more acceptable to God, because that's impossible. Jesus paid it all. And really unpacking that is so important, because otherwise it's just, again, performance, and that becomes the foundation of everything. And it can't be. It can't be.
Yeah. Brandon, dude, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me, man.
Well, Steve, I really enjoyed this interview. You know, I remember, you know, seeing the FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, when I was in high school and in college.
Right.
You know, I knew people that were involved with it, but I myself I was never really an athlete, so I wasn't involved with it at all. So it was really cool to just hear somebody's perspective on it like that. And honestly, before I even listened to this interview, I didn't know that was your cousin. So that was just fun fact information as we were recording earlier. But all that to say is, I also didn't know that. So can you clarify what the situation was with the Russians and the Olympics? Because y'all kind of touched on it, but this is just one thing I was like, I still didn't understand what's going on with this. Because it sounded slimy. What can you tell the viewers what that was?
Yeah. Well, the part of the conversation that set that up, Matthias, I was asking about, and I can't remember the year when the U.S. Fielded. I don't know if you say fielded in basketball. They courted the dream team that had like Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. I think Magic Johnson was there. You know, some big star basketball players, and they just annihilated everybody. And I remember that one of the classy things about the Olympics is that it was the amateurs. It wasn't the best professionals. It was the best amateurs, and that tied into what Brandon was talking about. That part of the problem that the U.S. had at times is that our amateurs, our college age kids, would go over and they would compete with basically adults, especially in the Soviet country, the Eastern Bloc countries. Guys who grew up doing nothing but playing the sport, and they were literally older than our college kids. So he mentioned the 1972 Summer Olympics. And I didn't know about this either, Matthias. So what I did know is I'm pretty sure it was in 1972 where one of the nations stormed the Israeli dormitory and held them for hostage. And I don't remember all that, but it was the gold medal match, and the Soviets were up into like the last minute of the game. One of the U.S. guys was fouled, and they were just down by one. U.S. was down by one, and he stepped up and he did both of his three free throws, and he got him. And there was like 3 seconds left on the clock, and the Soviets threw the ball in, and the 3 seconds wound down, and the U.S. won. But what happened is that for some reason, one of the officials stopped the game. He said, "Oh, the Soviets called timeout, and no one had a record of the Soviets calling timeout." Well, okay, so they replayed it, and then they did the 3 seconds again, and the 3 seconds ended before the Soviet player put a ball in the basket, and the U.S. thought, "Well, we won again." And someone said, "No, no, 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 we got to stop because the clock keeper, whoever the clock keeper, whoever runs the clock didn't set it right, so we got to do it again." And then they did it again, and this time a Soviet guy threw the ball all the way down to the end, and another Soviet player got it and did the layup and put it in. And so even to today, there's this, did the Soviets really win, or did the refs help them out? Because that's kind of the way it looks.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that either. It was interesting when I got into this. I thought Brandon might talk about the origins of basketball. I was really fascinated in the fact that basketball took off so fast. I didn't know this, but it kicked off in like 1891.
Yeah, I didn't know.
Guy,
that was another thing I learned. I did not know basketball was a recent kind of invention. I don't know. I guess in my mind, I've always thought basketball has probably been around for a real long time, since like the Coliseum or something. But
baseball's been around since the mid 1800s. I didn't really know that either, but it was brought up in a Civil War documentary I was watching. But basically, you had a guy who worked with the YMCA, which is a Young Man's Christian Association. And he worked for YMCA up in Massachusetts, where it gets cold, in January, and they were saying, "What can we do to come up with a sport in the winter that's indoors?" So he took a couple of peach baskets, put them up, and kind of put some rules together, and it was just fascinating that within 4 or 5 years, it was all over the world.
Yeah.
Um, but Brandon was talking about what's going on today, and I'll get to a challenge on that later on. But it was interesting to hear just some stuff about basketball that I think guys ought to at least know who the local team is. So they can, they're out. People are talking. They can know what's going on. So,
It just
so
helps
that
us
was
in, yeah.
interesting.
So, because I know we've talked about this concept. This is kind of a side note, just so the viewer understands. When you talk about like kind of knowing a little bit about a lot, is that
Mhm.
that way as Christians, just as men, we can engage with others and build connections and kind of just engage with people and things going on around us. Is that what you kind of mean with that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
You're doing life and you're doing a good job and you want to give influence, but you're working in an office situation, you're working in an academic situation, a factory situation, and you're there, and half the guys know something about the NFL team. Well, you could be arrogant and say, "Well, I'm not going to do that," or you can say, I'm going to learn a couple things about what's going on here, so I can engage with these guys in discussion." I think the same thing with basketball. Basketball is huge in Indiana. It's not that big in Texas, but there are people who enjoy the Rockets. And again, if you're in San Antonio, I mean, the Spurs, San Antonio Spurs are all over the place there, and they are in the playoffs, and we'll see how they do. But it was good to hear about that. It was good to hear about Brandon's own story, that things didn't really happen always the way he wanted them to happen, but he he showed his manhood. He pressed through even in the tough times, and those tough times molded him.
Yeah.
There's the proverbs about iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. But if we allow life, Matthias, to sharpen us, that's just as good sometimes. Doesn't feel good,
No.
but trusting God and pressing through.
Yeah, he definitely uses life to sharpen us as men. Hard times. I thought it was really funny. Just another side thing when you said that was a good cousin move of you when you went to the Kings to show him his portfolio, and they were like, "Well, you have videos." You're like, "No, I don't have any videos." They're like, "Come back when you have videos." I just thought he's like, "Well, yeah, now I know who to blame that I didn't get on a professional team,"
Yep,
and
yep,
it was
yep.
just funny. But that was a good cousin. That's a
Well,
good cousin.
of course, part of my motive there is that if he played for the Kings, he could have moved there and he could have helped us with our church plant, and
Yeah,
so
yeah. Then you got
really
a
yeah.
major NBA player backing you. That's funny. But yeah, so I mean, and I think when we were kind of talking about life, man, iron sharpens iron, and sometimes those life situations sharpen us as well that God uses, and I think one of those that he really addressed was talking about it wasn't a crisis of faith that he really went through, but a crisis of obedience,
Yeah,
and I like
yeah.
that because I kind of grew up in that same. I feel like I grew up in a very transitionary period, right? And it's probably because of the internet, like y'all talked about. Y'all talked about the just the spread of information. You used to go to a coach because you needed information, you need to know how to do something. Well, now you could, like y'all talked about, you could just get any information online anywhere, which is good, but
Mhm.
also can be bad because there's just
Yeah,
so much crap
yeah,
out there. You have to sift through it all.
yeah, yeah.
But that's not the point. The point is, I grew up in this transitionary period where the it's like I grew and maybe it's just the church culture I grew up in where it's like, you got your heaven, punch card, you have faith, you believe,
Mhm,
like,
mhm,
there you go,
mhm,
you're a Christian. And it's like,
mhm.
okay, now what? When he had this crisis of not faith, but of obedience, I like the way that he put that because I think every Christian at some point goes through
Yeah.
that to varying degrees where you go, okay, well, what's the main point of Christianity is to be like Christ, right? And
Mhm,
I like that
mhm.
y'all talked about that outflowing of your love for Christ and your relationship and being saved. It gives an outworking of those works, not that they save you, but
Yeah.
that they flow out from that place. And so I think there's a time where you work through it, and it's like I think just the Lord allows a certain amount of understanding, not necessarily just in here, but allows a little bit here and there into your heart to kind of keep working on making those changes. So
Mhm,
I
mhm.
really appreciated that part of the conversation. I've always loved the theological things. But what are your thoughts on that? What do you think about?
Well, I think Brandon was spot on, and I could speak about my own life that some of the things that I've wrestled with that I understand, but man, it just rubs me the wrong way,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure I want to do it. And Jesus was very clear. Brandon mentioned this in John chapter 14. Jesus said, "If you love me, you'll obey my commandments." And that's not this. And I said this. It's not this deal. Prove it, but it's this outflow.
Yeah.
It's the fruit
Hmm.
of my faith. And when Jesus gave what we refer to as the commission in Matthew chapter 28, he said, "Go and make disciples, not converts." Now, conversion is part of it.
Hmm.
He
That's just the
talked
beginning
about
part of it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's the change of a citizenship
Mhm.
that my heart's been redeemed. I like the way Brandon talked about it. That God has given me His righteousness, um, but then I walk in it. I grow in it, and that gets tough at sometimes. And
Yeah.
there's this guy named Henry Blackaby who wrote a book a long time ago called Experiencing God, and he referred to it as a crisis of belief. I say I believe this. Well, the real picture is what happens, you know, with what I do on a daily basis, and it's during those times of am I going to be obedient or not that the real character is formed, and that's what we want to encourage one another on to do.
Yeah. And something else that came to mind whenever y'all were talking about it, just a side thing is here as well, is, when Jesus, because he says, many will come to me and say, Lord, Lord, did we not do this or
Mhm.
cast out demons in your name and this and that? And he says, depart from me. I never knew you workers. And because he says right here, you workers of iniquity, you workers of
Yeah,
lawlessness.
yeah,
So that's where that aspect of obedience comes in again. It's, you can say you believe in Jesus, but like he says, if you love me, you'll do what I command. It's like you said, it's
mhm,
not
mhm.
like, oh, prove to me you love me. It's like it's more of a an
Yeah,
evidence of like, okay, I
mhm,
desire
mhm.
the things that God desires, which is obedience to Christ, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and James chapter 2, he talks about the fact that faith without deeds is dead. And I've run into legalistic jerks, and I just want to pound them, but they're always going around checking. It's like they're a Pharisee with a ruler to beat you.
right.
And it's they always have their own measurement of whether or not you're doing enough good works. But the point of James is, and he references Abraham. Abraham in Paul and Romans is very, very clear that Abraham was justified by faith. Well, that faith prompted Abraham to get up and leave Ur of the Chaldees and go into the promised land. So I think we've got some application there, guys, that when you're exploring Christianity, and those of you who already know Jesus, man, there are times where you need to just stop arguing and do what Jesus tells you to do.
Yeah. And then I think also another aspect of is, bad habits from before you come to Christ. There's sometimes I think that people just have a hard time really kind of either one, uh, working through these bad habits, or two,
Mhm.
understanding the detriment of some of these bad habits, or realizing it's a
Yeah.
bad habit, or something that isn't maybe not even sinful per se, but isn't what's the word I'm looking for? Isn't doesn't help with your becoming like Christ, you know?
Yeah. Productive, maybe. I
Yeah,
don't know.
is it
Yeah.
productive for becoming like Christ? That would be a good word there to use. But yeah, so we just wanted to kind of touch on the obedience thing. I thought that was, I always love the theological little tidbits here and there that we talk about.
Mhm, mhm,
So with all that being said,
mhm.
I kind of want to talk about about FCA. One of the main things that
Yeah.
about this whole conversation, not obedience, but that was important nonetheless. I think you said the saying was, can you remind me what the saying is? Because I remember it was really
Yeah,
good. It
yeah,
was nice and short.
and I like this, and that one of the first things I brought up, it's on their website, that we are placed what is it? Yeah. We are placed and gifted by God, time to make an impact, and the whole point, and this really ties in to the man identity,
Yeah.
that I am here on this planet, not by accident.
Mhm.
Uh, Psalm 139 talks about the fact, David talked about the fact that we are, God has knit us together in our mother's womb. So we are created, we are gifted, different gifts, different abilities. and now it's time to make an impact. In other words, get up and do something.
Yeah.
Get up and be proactive and do something with what God has given you.
Yeah, I think that's such a good message for not just for the athletes, but for young men in general. Not even young men, just
Mhm.
men. Just it's time to use the gifting that God's given you. And we've talked about this on other episodes we've done
Oh
previously,
yeah.
where we
Yeah.
talked about being like, be aware of like where's God gifted you. Think about your life. Where's God gifted you? Use that to glorify Him. And I love that He brought in. I think you said it was Ephesians 2:8 through 10. Is that correct?
Mhm.
Where
Mhm.
it says
Yeah.
He created
Yeah.
us for good works that He prepared beforehand for us.
Mhm.
And so it's like
Yeah.
he designed us, he made us to walk in these works where he's gifted us to glorify him and to serve and love others, to, bring his message, and disciple others. And I really love that. That's because that's like men in general, we're very purpose driven. And when we don't
Mhm.
understand our purpose, know we have purpose, or even believe we have purpose, that is where I think men fall into a lot of issues. And I can talk about that from my own experience where, I don't there's been points in my life where even now it's like, sometimes like what's my purpose? What am I good at? What am I really good at? And it's a struggle where Satan, I think, really gets in my head. Demons sometimes are just like, you're not good at anything. You're not, so I think
Mhm.
something that
Mhm.
men will struggle with, and I'm, talking from my own personal experiences, believing the lie that I'm really not good at anything or God
Mhm.
hasn't gifted me in anything. He, like we've talked about before this podcast, he was like, okay, he maybe loves me legally, but he doesn't really like me as his
Yeah.
child. And so I
Mhm.
think,
Mhm.
part of that goes back to what you and Brandon were talking about with um young men needing to, and you need to meet them where they're at as their coach. And I see that his purpose
Yeah.
and mission is not just to tell them to be good at a sport or how to be good or whatever. It's meeting them where they're at and kind of coaching the whole person, right?
Yeah, I was gonna get to that. I thought that was cool. That I think if we're talking biblical, the biblical word for that would be discipleship.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it. Yeah, basically coach the whole person, disciple. Yeah. And so I see his heart for that. It's really good because there are young men who, and like I think you addressed it too on the episode where y'all talked about, the fatherless epidemic we have really
Yeah.
affects young boys, especially with their confidence, their self assurance, their identity, their confidence in their abilities to do things. And you addressed this on another episode before. I'm kind of all over the place here with this because it's just such a big topic of man and identity and purpose. But you talked about basically it's it you know s- we need to stop being consumers and start creating.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think because of the culture of the internet, like y'all talked about, it's there's just so much that we kind of consume and are part of this thing a
Yeah.
lot instead of co-creating and finding that purpose and
Yeah.
that mission.
Yeah.
So I like, tying this all back to the FCA's, what's on their website, is there so much that goes into helping men understand these things about themselves to accomplish this, whether it's emotional, mental,
Mhm.
baggage, and we've talked a lot about a lot of these aspects here on the man identity. We could probably do a whole series on these things. So with all this talk about, kind of the FCA and what that statement in particular from the FCA kind of brings, do you have any challenges kind of associated with that, or maybe not even associated with that? What kind of challenges do you have?
Yeah, well, the first challenge is, I mean, this is a fun one. His Brandon's coach at UTEP was a guy named Don Haskins, and he was actually, and Brandon mentioned this. I didn't know this until Brandon said that he was the assistant coach for the U.S. basketball team in 1972. But Don Haskins coached at University of Texas, El Paso. I think it was called Texas Western at the time. But the movie is called Glory Road, came out in 2006. So this is just a fun challenge. Guys, next Friday or whenever, grab some buds, watch Glory Road. It's going to have a Hollywood twist on it, and as it always does. But there's some good character, really good character development in that movie. So do that. So for challenge, really, Matthias, what I've got today are two questions. Um, Brandon talked about loyalty and going both ways. Coaches are not loyal to the team. The members aren't really loyal to the team, and that's something that infuriates me a lot when you see, especially in football, you see a guy who holds out for more money, and I'm like, dude. I've seen it. That's when their careers, starts to tank when
Mhm.
they're wanting more money. But the idea of loyalty and so the question would be, guys, am I being loyal? Really being loyal to my, if you're married, am I being loyal to my wife? Am I being loyal to my church? Am I being loyal to my boss? And when it comes to work, maybe there's a time when careers change, and moves, stuff like that. But I think the real question is on a daily basis. In other words, guys, are you showing up to work and doing your best job? Or are you slouching out? So I can't even talk today. Are you slouching off thinking, well, there's something better around the corner? So, am I being loyal on a daily basis? Am I doing the best job I can? That also ties in, and Brandon and I, he touched on this just a tiny bit, going back to the fact that we are created to work. We are created to work. And you see in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, before sin enters the picture, that Adam's tending the garden. So the question being here is, guys, am I making the world better?
Mm.
Am I looking at the world? What are they going to do for me? Or am I looking, being loyal to what I've got in front of me today? And am I making the world a better place by what I'm putting into the world today? So, the fun challenge, hey, go watch Glory Road. Maybe, find out where you're, the closest in it, NBA team to you, are they even in the playoffs? A couple fun ones. And then, the big one is just ask those questions. Brandon talked about, getting to the deeper why questions. So, the two questions are, A, am I being loyal, or am I just being loyal when it's fun? Am I being loyal? And then number two, am I bringing good into the world today?
Yeah, Steve, those are some really good challenges. Some introspection, some reflective questions that are always good to ask, and I think those are some good ones. So, men, thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to ask yourself those questions this week. Figure those things out.
Yeah.
And as always, thank you for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow, download, whatever, share this,
Share, share.
every
Yeah,
single
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
So thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Man Identity. I think Steve and I we're in the midst of talking right now about kind of how we want to format this. Where do we want to go from here? So if you see
Mhm.
some changes, if you see, we're trying some new things out, thank you so much for sticking with us and, just give us your feedback. We'd love to understand, what do you like, what you don't like. You're not going to hurt our feelings. We want this to succeed. We want this to be
Yeah.
something that
Yeah.
builds you up, encourages you, edifies you. So if there's something that you're like, yeah, this is helpful. This is not as helpful. Let us
Mhm.
know. You're
Mhm.
not going to hurt our feelings. We want to do this, to serve you guys. So that's our main goal in this is to help you become better men, helping you to understand your identity and who you are as men in Christ. So
Yeah.
we just want to encourage you.
Be strong.
Yeah, I was going to say always be strong.